Pursuits of Urbanism. For those of you who don't know us, Pursuits is a two-term seminar in which we examine the makings of contemporary debates, how they're framed in housing and urbanism. This term we started with the problematic of a split between theory and practice, to look for a place where we could talk about how we feel about the urban-suburban landscape. The problematic is that there are views that cannot be fully and adequately stated in the language of architecture within the walls of the discipline. There isn't an emotive voice, a site for conversation about how one might feel in the guardian discourse of architecture, or that we haven't yet developed adequate skills of expression. In the seminar, we've been reading Harold Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence and a Map of Misreading to construct a commitment to a unique and personal theory of understanding the city. We've been influenced by Mark Doty's poetry about New York City and by Martha Nussbaum's moral and public imagination in developing the idea of representing the passions, an idea which I'm working on in my own work, and an idea which will wrap up this seminar in a few weeks' time when poet Jane Langley comes to talk about climbing around the extension of the Berlin Museum, someone who is not an architect but is going to talk about how she feels. Today we've invited Christophe Cornubert, partner at OMA in charge of design of the newly completed Educatorium at Utrecht University, to talk about his work with the implication that building has something to say. After today's presentation in this room, we'll move upstairs into a seminar format in Studio 2, and you're all welcome to join us up there for further conversation. Christophe's originally from Los Angeles, and that's where he and I met. He's worked for several years at OMA, and he's built several of their important buildings, for example, the Jussieu University Libraries. Today he's going to tell us about his work, and you'll be welcome then to ask him questions after the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Christophe.
Thank you. It's such a great pleasure to be in London. Anything to get out of Rotterdam, let me tell you. Actually, today I simply wanted to show you the last project that was recently completed by OMA, which is called the Educatorium, which is a project in Utrecht. And it's a project which I've been working on for for 4 years. 2 years of design and 2 years of construction. And believe me, 4 years doing anything is a long time. And definitely making a building is actually, I have to correct Tina, because in fact this is the first project that I worked on which was actually built. So in every sense this was a real crash course of what the reality of that is all about. Somehow at OMA I'd been through a series of projects, including like the ZKM project, and finally as a project leader on Jussieu Libraries. And both of those, if you know something about history, both basically sort of bit the dust, based on sort of the incredible delicacy, and yet let's say a lot of these very high-profile cultural projects, which start as competitions, etc. The problem with them is that they are also victim to all kinds of forces which are much beyond any kind of control. And in both those cases, really quite literally kind of political changes in both of those different countries, which basically sort of signed the death warrant for this project. So the Educatorium, for me, like I said, was the first project to be taken all the way to completion. And for the office was, one of the last projects since, in fact, Congress Expo. So the Educatorium, which is a name invented by the university, is in Utrecht University, which is more or less in the middle of Holland. The campus of this, or let's say the site of this university, is a kind of classic Dutch site, in the sense that it's basically an area outside of the main city center, on the outside of the kind of ring highway So truly a peripheral site. And this is a photograph of the model, and I hope it's in focus. In any case, I mean, if you've ever been to Holland, you know it is the kind of ultimate generic situation. Basically, the landscape, if you can call it that, is more or less like this. Ultimately flat, ultimately green, and dotted with cows, basically. So this campus was more or less developed starting in the late 50s as part of the reconstruction. And I think some of the later buildings all the way into the 70s. And somehow the model is really perfect in capturing the kind of monotony that exists there. So actually our kind of relationship with the university started in terms of developing a master plan for them. And I'll just show you this one image. Essentially, again, you can see the kind of generic quality of the site. This is the kind of classic ring highway here, in this kind of open expanse. So basically, in this master plan, where the ambition was to make this university into a true campus, let's say in the American sense, meaning that there's kind of 24-hour life going on in this place, was the ambition. As a kind of strategy for space, basically, it was the creation of these pads, basically, each of which would house, let's say, different faculties of the university. Thereby also preserving a kind of significant amount of open green space that exists there. Now, the site in particular of this educatorium is here, and you can see it's basically sandwiched between this kind of monument, and on the other side, I'm actually looking at the site here. Well, basically, again, the site here, one side is, let's say, urban, other side is landscape, and so the building really sits on this kind of frontier between the two. Holland. So I understand that in this seminar there is this thing about the anxiety of influence, and I tell you somehow at OMA, I think that must be the kind of ultimate sort of Freudian experience in terms of agonizing over the anxiety of influence in every sense. For someone like myself, as let's say designer architect working in it or part of this office, but also in terms of, let's say, this kind of history, the legacy of the office itself, and what, on the one hand, this desire to ultimately always start with the tabula rasa, always start with something new, and yet having this kind of clearly certain references in the past. So you have things, well, again, on a more personal level, like the ZKM was perhaps the first thing I got thrown into, where you have this kind of stacking of programs, and finally Jussieu, where you have the idea of a continuous surface, continuous space, and therefore a kind of continuous programmatic possibility. So for the educatorium, I mean, which is somehow not so special to that project, but at the beginning of every design project is this kind of ultimate moment of suspension, where anything and everything goes, no matter how kind of dumb it might look, including the use of a kind of blue foam block, which is probably somehow the ugliest material ever invented. But basically the process is let's say the methodology, if there is one, I think one of its virtues is just allowing yourself to, in fact, be quite free and literally to experiment with different possibilities. Simultaneously with a kind of conceptual development, you're somehow, let's say, looking for clues in a way. So, I mean, don't be deceived by the slides, because in no way was it really a linear development, but in any case, somehow the proposition of these two interlocking surfaces seemed to be incredibly effective in dealing both with the specifics of the site as well as the program, but let's say perhaps conceptually satisfying in the sense that on the one hand, you have quite different readings. You have the reading of these two forms that are interlocking each other, however quite different. You have the kind of soft limp versus the kind of much more hard one. You also have the development of a continuous space through the entire building. In the sense, the Educatorium, which is this kind of bogus Latin, meaning something like factory of education, in many ways is almost a kind of compression of the whole university experience, in the sense that you have the social happening, you have the education happening, then you have the testing, all taking place in this one sort of compressed area. So this is the piece more or less in its site. It's bounded by these two buildings. This is actually, in fact, continues something like 200-meter long project here. And then this sort of tower block on one side. The Educatorium also needed to literally act as a kind of seamless connection between this. Well, the weather's pretty miserable in Holland, so. So here's just very quickly development of the, let's say, the stratification of the project. On the ground level, you have actually underneath the bicycle parking for 1,000 something like 1,000 cyclists. You have this extended entrance plaza, you could say, which is partly outside, partly inside, which allows these connections to the two other buildings we just mentioned. And then a large canteen for something like 1,000 students. Stacked above it, continuing this entrance ramp, are the two auditoria spaces, and then a series of, let's say, pause areas or intermission areas. And finally, in this larger block, which is sort of floating above the entrance, are two levels of essentially large examination rooms. So I think simply as a kind of way of understanding the project is perhaps to almost literally take the idea of a kind of architectural sequence is fundamental to it, and hopefully if it's successful, there's not any one particular sequence, but almost literally infinite amount. But here we'll just sort of take one possibility. Now again, the whole entrance area is essentially designed for dealing with sort of mass movements of people, where you literally have hundreds of people sort of pouring out of auditoria or moving towards auditoria. Hundreds of people just simply cutting through the building, not even using it specifically, moving down to the canteen. So in fact, the entire sort of ground area at the front is designed to allow, let's say, maximum smoothness of these mass movements, shall we say. So basically the surface splits, one part moving down towards the canteen and otherwise moving up. Over this glass floor. This glass floor basically acts as a kind of extended threshold as you come up the ramp and then move on to, in a way, let's say, the kind of specific territory, the more academic territory of it. I was surprised people were actually really terrified to walk on this glass floor. And they would sort of come to the edge and then basically gasp. And then also I had some complaints. Someone said, well, what about women wearing skirts? And so I told them, well, yeah, that's why I put spotlights below, which are beaming up. And somehow architecture is also this kind of material, which is, in this case, a kind of analysis and breakdown of the program itself, and trying to understand this and look for actual potentials in it. Somehow lost in the bottom somewhere was one program which was in Dutch what they call a pause area, which would roughly translate as literally intermission or coffee break space. The idea being that basically for Dutch students it's impossible to get through a 45-minute lecture without having at least one cup of coffee. So it becomes like a really important part of it. So in fact, it was actually a relatively large space that was being asked for. And at a certain moment, it seemed clear that this pause area actually offered almost a kind of key to what this building could be about. If we were serious in attempting to make it a kind of campus center, was the idea that instead of just one room or one space provided for this, that we could actually then start to break up this intermission space into various different spaces which could then be sort of moved throughout the building. But at the same time that these kinds of intermission areas could be more or less blended with the circulation, so that each one, in fact, literally can be enhanced by the other. So what tends to look like sort of incredibly generous circulation areas, if you do a kind of strict analysis of building, in fact, the percentage of circulation is quite the same as a conventional building. But this generosity actually comes from this meshing of circulation with actual programmatic space. So that here, like in this entrance plateau, on the one hand, indeed, at its kind of maximum, you can have hundreds of people sort of just, herding through this space. At other times, in fact, it can be actually completely a programmatic area. So these images are, in fact, taken in this block, which is more or less floating above this entrance area. Here you can see also the slope down towards the bicycle parking underneath. You can actually ride your bike sort of through the building underneath. And to try and keep this area as free as possible, in fact, this whole block is more or less suspended from these sort of mega I-beams on the roof. And here you can see a shot of a model of what's happening in here. And basically, on this level, actually in these two levels, are the examination rooms, which are given a kind of much more sober effect, shall we say, given the kind of needs of it. On one hand, you can see a kind of radical difference of the south side, which has much more opacity to it, compared to the north side of the project, which you also see in the elevation, which is sort of ultimately transparent. Where the view towards the landscape basically is projected inside and in fact becomes the main atmosphere of the space. So these are the two levels of the examination area. That image is here of the largest space, which is something like 300 students, and you see that you get these very unusual proportions because of this almost, let's say, monofunctional aspect of the program, where it's not literally a classroom, it's too big to be a classroom, but in fact you just have to deal with, Holland is a kind of incredibly democratic place. So the idea is that when everyone takes an exam, everyone literally has to take it at the same time. So what they do is they actually rent like convention halls and soccer stadiums, and they sort of set it up with chairs so that all the students can take their test at the same time. So finally this building, let's say, allows for this kind of quite strange or let's say special program. Finally, the outside here, which is the roof above the two auditorias, is a green roof. So this is a kind of fifth facade from everyone in the building looking down on it. So you can see how the north side is basically almost, in certain terms, nothing in terms of design. It's basically just the edge of a slab and then all glass, which, of course is not as easy to achieve as it sounds, but in that sense, this is literally a sort of section through the project where the programs become visible. And here you can see that in this most kind of basic level is this sort of cruciform axes or circulation spaces, which more or less then form these sort of four sort of zones around it, which are the main programmatic areas. Now this is kind of, there's been a few articles recently in some Dutch magazines. And there's a certain controversy amongst certain sort of Calvinist Dutch intellectuals about what's happening in this part of the project here, where, yes, on the one hand, there is clearly in the form of the building this idea of literally taking a slab of concrete and simply folding it and bending it, manipulating it to do precisely what you want it to do. On the other hand, when you start dealing with construction and this kind of endless series of obstacles, which it sometimes seems to be, there's this moment where dealing with the situation at hand and this kind of conceptual literalness, well, let's say the question is posed. So, in some of this writing, there keeps coming back this idea of the fold, which is a kind of perhaps popular theme at the moment. So, how does the construction here deal with this aspect of the fold? Well, what's shocking is that what looks like a concrete element on the outside, in fact, here you can see that it's actually a steel structure. So, in fact, here there's really the ability to try and look for freedoms, in fact, and not necessarily let some kind of conceptual clarity also restrain you at the same time. Somehow architecture, and especially building, let's say, is also about taking advantage of opportunities which more or less arise at the moment. So, in essence, there's a kind of necessity from certain Dutch technological standards. What started as a concrete shell, in fact, becomes a metal shell. But the surprising thing is that the certain essential beauty of it, in many ways, is beyond what could have been imagined. The outside, nevertheless, is actually using a spray concrete, which was actually smoothed out by hand in an almost medieval process. But I guess what some of them didn't realize is that since I'm from Southern California, a lot of this esoteric French literature is not so available out there. So rather than folds, in fact, I'm more interested in waves. So this was actually a kind of secret programmatic possibility. This is kind of illegal photograph taken in space. No comment. But again, this folded or curved space essentially is again one of these kinds of key elements of the project, where on the one hand, clearly it does function as a kind of extended corridor, but at the same time, this entire space becomes a kind of gigantic hangout, which the students can basically occupy themselves. And in many ways, the building is almost provoking the students, or let's say the users, to in fact figure out what to do with the building themselves. This is a projection booth for one of the auditorias, which is actually made by some yacht makers. The next tray, please. Now again, you can almost, perhaps in this model shot, visualize it a bit more clearly, this kind of ultimate figured ground where, let's say, these elements are the figures, everything else, obviously the ground, and yet in many ways, the experience of what this building is, or the experience of the building, can in fact be the ground more significantly than the figures themselves. But also in this image, I just want to show you that. So the space, we just saw the curved space here in the back, and finally these two auditorias are imagined almost as almost like camped out on this slope. So the smaller one is for 400. Essentially, these two bare concrete walls with the sort of acoustic elements placed in it. Exposed steel structure, which went through a lot of transformations, but essentially it's incredibly tight, packed series of I-beams which are spanning it. So in essence, the effect that you can see here is literally as a kind of surface of steel. We're playing with how surfaces can be self-supporting. The next auditorium, separated by this sort of central staircase on the north side. And again, the south side, dense, opaque, and closed, and the north side, much more transparent. So despite what I said earlier, in fact, yes, there was specific interest in how one concrete slab actually could be manipulated to actually achieve quite different needs, shall we say, in terms of spans. And this edge here, which is basically the edge with the auditorium space behind it, had to achieve something like a 20-meter span on the interior, obviously to avoid columns in the auditorium space. So this is one of the moments where the kind of collaboration with the engineers is kind of ultimately crucial, and obviously it is in this kind of project where structure and architecture are literally the same in many ways. So in sort of brainstorming, imagining how could you make a concrete slab actually span this immense distance without it becoming incredibly thick, like 1 meter thick. In any concrete slab, we know that basically you have the kind of steel reinforcement which is placed in the bottom of it. So conceptually, the idea was, well, okay, so what if you could take this reinforcement and just more or less sort of pull it out of the concrete underneath it, which both would give you a deeper structure as a kind of truss-like action. But then each material starts to work at almost 100% effectiveness. So the steel goes into pure tension, and the concrete goes into almost pure compression. So that, well, here's an image, in fact, from the engineers, which, I'm told gives structural engineers a kind of orgasm to see this, basically, where basically you're seeing the stress actually change basically completely from one state to another state, which is from basically tension or hybrid tension into just pure compression. But at the same time, I guess what was beautiful for me is that this is one of the kind of rare moments where a kind of initial sketch, comes to almost some kind of perfect realization as a result. And I'm not sure if it proves its success, but clearly here was also attempting to just look for a kind of complete abstraction of what structure can be, but at the same time a revelation of it. And but here I really get quite the gamut of comments from people asking, is it decoration, or is that to hang lights on? So in a way, this kind of lack of understanding of it is well, for me, it was a surprise, because I thought, in fact, the opposite would be clear, that here the structure is quite evident. The forces themselves are basically made physical in a way. But on the other hand, the kind of almost complete abstraction of it makes it difficult to achieve that comprehension. Now, apparently in Japan, there's a lot of women truck drivers who wear skirts. So it forced them to invent a special type of glass, which is a privacy glass, which is being demonstrated here. And this glass is actually laminated with a holographic film, which, and you can sort of make out in these diagrams changes from a state of, let's say, transparency to translucence. So for example, this figure, it shows that in this sort of triangle here, it is transparent, and in this zone it becomes translucent. So it actually literally shifts its state depending on the angle of view. And in this case, basically this facade which you see in the construction here, which sort of wraps the north side of this auditorium, its main function was literally as an acoustic screen, because outside here, let's say between the exterior facade and the auditorium is a corridor or a passageway. So we needed an acoustic screen for obvious reasons. So as you start to imagine, well, what do you need in this, or what becomes possible in it to develop a kind of second skin on the interior? It became interesting to imagine the idea that one construction or one material could actually do several things. So in this case, auditorium also needs a certain amount of privacy for people to be able to concentrate, so that in fact the glass itself becomes a medium of allowing this almost complete privacy on the one hand, and yet also kind of ultimate view out and in at the same time. So you can actually make it out where it's sort of fading out from, or fading in or fading out from transparent into translucent. And finally, on the ground floor, after sort of doing a kind of loop through the project, it was again this task of, well, okay, imagine 1,000 students eating, university cafeteria food, which is, a very difficult thing to imagine in many ways. But how to keep it from having this kind of almost military-like mess hall quality on the one hand, and yet, in fact, just the reality is, you have to somehow efficiently deal with these numbers. So somehow the canteen, obviously on the one hand, has this kind of very changing aspect of the slope above it, so that clearly on one side you have a space which is some 8 meters high, whereas let's say at the other end you have something that's less than 4 meters. So you have, just with the slope itself, actually immense range and contrast within the space. But I think what you can make out here, which is also something that sort of goes through the project, is this almost dematerialization of the structure that takes place as you move from the south, which is packed with closed program and literally has a wall, towards the north, which is towards the view, let's say. So if you look at the column, there's not a grid in here, it's more like a series of lines, quite literally. And this series of lines basically erodes or disappears as it moves towards the north side, to the point where you have a span here of some 30 meters across and almost 15 meters back, where it's completely column-free. So that, in fact, the columns themselves become a kind of generator of a kind of ambient condition around it, so that there's, through this basic move, generated quite a variety of different spaces within this large space. Glass fins holding the facade on the outside. Quite jumbo glass here, which is a struggle in Holland, but over 6 meters by 2 meters. Again, here in the south side, you can see the elevation is radically different. It becomes really more literally a collage of different materials and different opacities, which gives yet a different reading of the project, where perhaps the multiplicity of programs become more clear on this side, ironically. Well, that's all I wanted to show you today. Actually, I was at the project a couple of months ago, showing some friends from Hong Kong the project. So we were down in the canteen afterwards, sort of relaxing, and it was quite amazing. I was almost literally physically accosted by this middle-aged woman who I found out actually teaches at the university. And it was at that moment that I really kind of started to understand the potential power of architecture. In this case, kind of illustrated in this negative way, but my friends from Hong Kong were like also incredibly, they'd never seen anything like this. So somehow the building, its reception has perhaps had this duplicity to it, of either extreme enthusiasm or in fact this almost antagonistic feeling towards it. Well, that's all I have to tell you today. So thanks for getting through that.
Does anyone have a question now that they'd like to ask Christophe while the images are fresh on our minds? Or should we break? Gordana, please.
Can I just something a bit more nostalgic? Just because this idea of the section, and that in a way is folding and that's creating that shape, in a way is also representing Koolhaas's Karlsruhe entry. How was this project done before or after the Karlsruhe project? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know quite what you're talking about.
What's the relationship between the two?
Well, let's say chronologically spoken, the Educatorium predates Cardiff. Yeah.
In a way, that was the kind of a similar kind of idea of the section and fold slab that was in respect to the
Well, I can only say yes and no, and I think you, in a way, you can analyze it as well as I can probably. But I mean, there's definitely a flip between a kind of formal similarity. Yes, there is this looping that's going on. I think in certain terms it is actually nevertheless doing quite different things, or being used with a different effect, shall we say, or a different architectural ambition. But somehow, I mean, you can also look at the Jussieu Bibliothèque, and I think there's also a kind of obvious legacy for it. And I mean, I personally had this kind of direct connection. I finished Jussieu and that project went down, and then started Educatorium. But I could say that there was a kind of genuine feeling for the Jussieu project of almost a kind of rare moment of eureka, where we felt like we'd really discovered, in a way, almost a new technique of an almost effortless way of making any space you want. You just take the surface and you just bend it, you cut it, so you just literally have a kind of incredible freedom in developing, let's say, the needs of the programmatic differences. So I think this idea, or perhaps this identification of this, let's say, way of making forms, clearly is stuck in certain terms. And although, again, conceptually, I think you see that, well, they are being used differently as a kind of formal move. Yeah, it's clearly undeniable in certain ways.
But it's not only that they formally look similar, it's a kind of an attitude that in a way emphasizes section as something which in a way could be more explicitly read on the building.
Yeah, well, that's definitely part of it. It's but it's also in terms of literally how a surface itself can generate or can be allowed to generate actually very different conditions. And I mean, I think in Educatorium, obviously, well, simply because it's actually built project, you see how this idea, on the one hand, I think is blurred in certain terms, where this kind of unorthodox change from concrete to steel, for example, makes you wonder perhaps, and yet, again, there is this, let's say, allowance of certain detail and difference to take place in what starts as a kind of very basic move of this folding. But that within this fold, basically, in fact, then there's, let's say, second moves or other forces that are sort of projected on it, be it either the plan or the ceiling as a structure, which then allow this one surface, in fact, to still, let's say, do quite different things and generate quite different atmospheres in it. So I don't know if that answers your question. But yes?
Yes, I had a question about you didn't show us much of the master plan, but I was interested in how, say, this one specific project related perhaps spatially to a larger strategy of development of the whole university. Do you have an idea about how, say, this particular spatial ordering plays out over a larger area, or do you have an idea about other buildings that might supplement or articulate these kinds of things?
Well, I guess a few different things you could say. On the one hand, again, the basic ambition for the master plan was the creation of a campus, with exactly what that means. Meaning that before, literally this was a place, and in some ways it's just going through the transition now with this project, but there's a couple new buildings also, one's by Willem Jan Noordlings and another by Meccano. I've also started to really change the feel of the campus a bit. But I mean, otherwise, until then, it was the kind of place where the students actually live in the student center, you know, the kind of picturesque part of Utrecht. And they sort of ride their bikes, go to their class, and then leave. So, you know, it's amazing when you go there, you're told that, well, this campus has something like 30,000 students. When you go there, it often feels quite deserted, quite empty, and obviously that explains a lot of it. So as a kind of antidote for that, indeed the ambition is to bring in all these other types of programs, everything from housing to certain amount of shopping to recreation, et cetera, other types of infrastructure which allows it to have a kind of continuous lifestyle, shall we say. So I think if you just take that idea in mind, that the building is almost a kind of fractal of that, in the sense that, well, okay, it is the student center. There's perhaps more than one, but in a way this is the newest and the most clear new identity for the campus. So again, aside from the specific programs, the building is shared by all the different faculties, so it's not for any particular field of study, but that means that, again, it acts as a kind of urban square, in a way, a place of exchange. Literally, students from all the faculties are coming to use this building, so they're sort of intersecting each other there, which is something that doesn't really take place now. And also the building can be used for, you know, outside things, for professional symposia, etc. So then the building also is a kind of link between the campus and, you could say, the city or the outside, in a way. So it has these sort of other aspects to it. But when I was trying to describe this idea of this strong figure ground, and the idea that the ground, which is this kind of free territory, which literally can be occupied, hopefully, by the students, and you can almost imagine a kind of tribal occupation where, you know, whatever, the engineers are in one section, you know, the kind of cool people are hanging out here, you know, blah, blah, blah. So that this kind of diversity, but also the idea is that hopefully, you know, you won't get bored to death after being there for a couple hours, so that even, again, the climate in Holland, well, it's not so different from here. It can be pretty miserable. So, you know, the title of the booklet that was made for this project was called Synthetic Landscape, and in some ways that's what it's trying to do, is generate in this building, actually, nevertheless, the possibility for quite a hell of a lot of different things to go on, and even one individual user going from one space to another space would be able to switch to a completely different feeling or atmosphere, you know, be it quiet or noisy, a lot of people, empty, all these things, so that hopefully the building also, as a student center, you know, hopefully can succeed in allowing quite a lot of different desires to be kind of fulfilled in there. But also allowing completely different activities to happen simultaneously, but relatively autonomously, which is also what the campus is about. So I mean, there's that, let's say, conceptual link on just a kind of pure, what it does or what it generates. Well, I mean, there's other things that I didn't mention. I mean, for example, but again, the siting of the project is on this kind of frontier between one side, which is unbuilt, more or less landscape, and then the other side, which is, the urban, shall we say. That's where all the buildings are sort of condensed on this one pad. So the building sits just on this juncture, and then in the perpendicular direction is actually another street which is projected to become a kind of, what shall we say, main street of the campus, a kind of main social street where all kinds of light programs will exist and at the same time acts as a connector in the opposite direction from the landscape to things like student housing. So that the building now sits at a kind of crossroads to it. So hopefully the building, becomes like a first density, let's say, or a first gravity, point of gravity, until some of the other buildings come online, which, like I said, there's already a couple others which start to generate a new atmosphere. But nevertheless, let's say from the beginning, from the completion of this one project, there's already a change for the entire area. Uh-oh.
Well, you were talking about the miserable weather, but in summer it gets very hot. What happens to the building then? Because then it becomes like an oven, it seems to me. Do you have like things coming down to
Well, I'm curious what kind of perception you're using in this. But I can tell you that last summer it was sort of, last summer was like sort of one of the hottest in kind of recorded memory for the Dutch. And in certain spaces, like the canteen space, which you saw, which has 8 meter just pure glass, there was a kind of obsession about, oh my God, it's gonna overheat, So we went through all these incredible analyses with the mechanical engineers to figure out, blah blah blah. Finally, have a strategy of a certain amount of trees to also enhance or provide a certain amount of shading for that entire facade. But last summer, those trees were not in place, so it was completely exposed to this incredible heat, and never at any moment was it uncomfortable in the space. And so in fact, I mean, there's a lot of other attributes of the building which I didn't describe because it's not expected that OMA talks about these things. But actually the building is a kind of Dutch showcase of sustainable building, which means a lot of different things, but let's say the whole strategy of how it's made and the way materials are used is for them a kind of major leap forward. But also, for example, the entire building is, there's no cooling at all in the building. And in fact, its form and some of the strategies we used completely take advantage of just natural phenomena, be it sun, lack of sun, but also, for example, you might have noticed in the canteen there's these quite large elements, windows, which can be, opened. And so it also turns out that the kind of continuity of the space actually creates these sort of almost microclimates within it, where you have circulation happening across the entire length of the building, which is like 80 meters or something. So in fact, it's proven itself to be kind of highly effective in let's say just taking advantage of natural phenomena without having to add mechanical extras to it. So anyway, the short answer is no, it doesn't get too hot.
But did you design like the side around it as well? Because knowing Dutch students, whenever there is a sun, they'll go outside.
Yeah.
Did you design the area around it as well? You can provide that kind of area for where it doesn't need to be placed outside as well as inside the building?
Well, definitely, and perhaps there's two ways, and it's a pity I don't have an image to show you, but you might remember, you have the canteen, you have this huge leaning facade. Just directly outside of it is this pedestrian street I was describing, let's say, and this space continues towards this kind of small canal, along which the street is. And this whole entire area, it's almost as if you kind of projected the building into the water, so that the space between will become a kind of large patio space, literally. So indeed, when the weather is nice, which may not be very often, but indeed when it's there, you're right. Everybody, wants to take advantage of it. You can open up all these doors in the facade, and then the canteen can kind of spill outside. But at the same time, in a way, the strategy of having this kind of enormous glass facade was that when you're sitting in there, it's almost like sitting outside. And you make a kind of painful look at me when I said that. But it's literally, I don't know, if you imagine sitting next to 6 meters of glass, it's all I can say is that it seems to just go on forever, basically. And it's a strange thing about using glass this size. On the one hand, it has this visceral quality where it actually becomes almost heavy. You can almost imagine the weight of this huge pan of glass. But then it's ultimately transparent. It's ultimately not there. So sitting, let's say, for example, near the facade is this incredible experience when there's sunlight. That basically you're almost in literally an outdoor condition, but obviously you're still protected by the facade. So obviously if there's sunlight, it can still be incredibly cold, so it's not completely related. But there's an attempt to literally, there's all these cliches about, the creation of indoor-outdoor space. I don't even want to get into that. But somehow, just by its sheer scale, I think it succeeds in doing that. That's when you're in this space towards the facade, you almost have the sense that you're basically sitting in a kind of sheltered and yet exterior environment.